The morning sun rose over New Haven, just like it had for the past 30 years since humans first landed on this world. Jake Morrison stood at his command station on the orbital defense platform and watched the farms below turning green with earth crops that had learned to grow in alien soil. 12,000 people called this place home now, and most of them had been born here under these foreign stars. 3 generations of children had played in those streets and learned to walk under a sky that was just a little more purple than the one their ancestors knew. Jake had been stationed here for 5 years and he loved every minute of it. The defense platform was old, and the weapons were outdated, but nobody really thought they would ever need them. Humanity had been reaching out to the stars for decades, and they had found nothing but empty worlds and silent space. The universe seemed peaceful, and New Haven was proof that humans could build something beautiful far from Earth. Lisa Brennan was bringing her transport ship into orbit when her sensors started screaming. She had been flying the Horizon's call for 8 years, and she knew every sound her ship made. But this was new, and it was wrong. Her screen showed something massive coming out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. She opened a channel to Jake's platform, and her voice was shaking when she spoke. The ships that appeared were like nothing in any human database. They were dark red and shaped like blades, and there were dozens of them. Jake saw them on his screens and felt his stomach drop. He had spent years training for first contact scenarios, and every single one of them started with communication and peaceful protocols. He sent out greetings in every language Earth had programmed into the automated systems. He broadcast humanity's intentions for peace and friendship. The red ships did not respond. Governor Paul Henderson was in his office reviewing farming reports when Jake's emergency signal came through. Paul had built New Haven from nothing more than prefabricated shelters and hope. He had married couples and delivered babies and signed off on the construction of schools and hospitals. The idea that someone would come here to hurt his people seemed impossible. He activated the colony-wide alert system, but he told Jake to hold fire. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe these aliens just needed time to respond. The Rekath opened fire without warning. Their weapons were not lasers or missiles or anything human militaries had ever imagined. The beams that came from their ships unmade matter at the molecular level. They did not explode things or burn them. They simply erased them from existence. The 3 human frigates that moved to intercept lasted less than 2 minutes. One moment they were there, and the next moment there was just empty space where they had been. Jake knew he was about to die. His platform had shields that were designed to stop asteroids and micrometeors, but these weapons cut through them like they were not even there. He looked at the planet below and thought about all those people going about their morning routines. Kids were probably sitting in classrooms right now. People were eating breakfast and complaining about their jobs and making plans for the weekend. He had to warn Earth. He had to make sure somebody knew what happened here. Katie Walsh was teaching her 2nd grade class about Earth history when the emergency sirens started. She had been a teacher on New Haven for 3 years, and she loved her students like they were her own children. 22 kids looked up at her with confused faces when the lights started flashing red. Katie kept her voice calm even though her heart was racing. She told them it was just a drill, and they needed to go to the emergency shelter under the school. She made them hold hands in a line, and she sang songs while they walked down the stairs into the reinforced bunker. Dr. Greg Phillips was making his rounds at the hospital when the power flickered. He had delivered half the babies in New Haven and patched up countless injuries from farming accidents and construction mishaps. The hospital had 200 beds, and most of them were full right now with routine cases, broken bones and infections, and people recovering from surgery. He started organizing the nurses to move patients to the lower levels, but he knew in his gut that it would not matter. The emergency broadcast was saying something about hostile ships, but the words did not make sense. Jake's platform was coming apart around him. Whole sections were just vanishing as the Frekath weapons touched them. His crew of 40 people were dying, and he could not save any of them. He reached the data capsule launch bay and manually loaded in everything his computers had recorded. Every sensor reading and every tactical scan. He encrypted it with quantum keys that only Earth military computers could break. His hands were steady as he programmed the capsule to jump to faster than light speed the moment it cleared the platform. The Vrekath weapons were hitting the planet now. Katie held her students in the shelter and sang louder to cover the sounds of the bombardment above. The children pressed against her, and she stroked their hair and told them everything would be okay, even though she knew it was a lie. The shelter walls were shaking and dust was falling from the ceiling. One little girl asked if her mommy was safe, and Katie said yes, because what else could she say? Jake recorded his final message while fire and vacuum consumed his station around him. His voice was clear and calm and full of rage. He said to tell Earth what they did here. He said to make them pay. He hit the launch button, and the data capsule shot away from the dying platform at impossible speed. 30 seconds later, the platform ceased to exist, and Jake Morrison died without even feeling it. The Frekath did not just destroy New Haven, they cracked the planet itself with weapons that reached down into the crust and tore it apart from the inside. The world that had taken 30 years to build took 12 minutes to die. Katie and her students were gone. Dr. Phillips and his patients were gone. Governor Henderson and his dreams of a peaceful colony were gone. 12,000 people stopped existing, and the Rekath fleet watched it happen with cold satisfaction. The aliens left after they confirmed there was nothing alive remaining in the system. They had sent humanity a message about strength and weakness and territory. They believed humans would understand their place now. They believed this small act of extermination would make humanity afraid. They jumped back into faster-than-light travel and headed home to report their success. The data capsule reached Earth 3 weeks later, traveling faster than any ship humanity had ever built. It carried Jake Morrison's final words and the complete record of how New Haven died. It carried sensor data about the Rekath ships and their impossible weapons. It carried the last moments of 12,000 human lives. The capsule was received by military computers at Earth's defense headquarters, and its contents were immediately flagged as Priority Alpha. Within 1 hour, every government on Earth knew what had happened. Within 6 hours, emergency sessions were being called. Within 12 hours, humanity's response was already being planned. The Frekath thought they had taught humanity a lesson about power. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. They had taught humanity that the galaxy was not safe, and that peaceful intentions meant nothing to those willing to commit genocide. They had taught humanity that some species only understood one language. Humanity was about to respond in terms the Rekath would understand perfectly. The data capsule sat in a secure facility, and its contents were analyzed by thousands of military minds. Every weapon signature was studied. Every tactical mistake the Rekath made was noted. Every weakness in their formations was identified and catalogued. Earth's shipyards began working around the clock, and soldiers began training for scenarios they had hoped would never happen. 3 weeks after New Haven died, the Frekath were still celebrating their easy victory. They had no idea that the humans were coming. They had no idea what humanity was capable of when pushed beyond all limits. They had no idea that they had just signed their own civilization's death warrant. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you killed human children and thought there would be no consequences. Admiral Richard Cole received the data capsule in the war room beneath Geneva, and his world changed in the time it took to watch Jake Morrison's final transmission. Richard had served in Earth's military for 35 years, and he had seen combat in the resource wars and the Mars independence conflict, but nothing had prepared him for this. He watched New Haven die on a dozen screens at once, and his hands gripped the edge of the console so hard his knuckles turned white. When the footage ended, he stood in silence for a full minute before he spoke to anyone. President Helen Carter was in her residence when the call came through at 3 a.m. She listened to Richard's summary without interrupting, and then she asked him to send her everything. She sat in her office for 2 hours watching the recordings from every angle and reading the tactical analysis, and when the sun came up she had not moved from her chair. Her assistant brought coffee, but it sat untouched and grew cold. Helen had been elected on a platform of peaceful expansion and scientific discovery, but that version of the universe had just died with 12,000 colonists. The emergency session of the unified Earth Council convened 8 hours after the capsule arrived. Representatives from every nation and every major colony gathered in the chamber that had been built to handle disputes about mining rights and trade agreements. The chamber fell silent when the screens lit up with footage from New Haven. Ambassador Frank Lou from the Pacific Coalition watched a building full of children vanish from existence, and he felt something break inside him. He had spent 20 years arguing for diplomatic solutions and peaceful coexistence, but what diplomacy could answer this? Dr. Amy Lawson ran the Xenological Institute, and she had spent her entire career preparing humanity for first contact with alien intelligence. She had written papers about communication protocols and cultural exchange and mutual benefit. All of that seemed like naive fantasy now. She studied the Vrekath weapon signatures and ship designs, and what she found terrified her more than the attack itself. The Vrekath had not stumbled onto New Haven by accident. Their approach vector showed they had known exactly where the colony was, and their attack pattern showed they had planned this. They had deliberately chosen to kill 12,000 humans as their introduction to Earth. Admiral Cole stood before the council and laid out the military situation in terms everyone could understand. Humanity had been exploring space for decades, but they had always maintained a defensive posture. The ships they built were designed to protect colonies and transport goods and defend against pirates or accidents. What they did not have was an offensive fleet capable of projecting power across interstellar distances. What they did not have was weapons designed to fight a war of extermination. He paused and let that sink in before he continued. What they did have was the industrial capacity to build those things and the technical knowledge to make them devastating. President Carter called for a vote on protocol. Nightfall and every hand in the chamber went up. The protocol had been written 50 years ago by people who understood that humanity's violent history might repeat itself among the stars. It was simple and terrible in its clarity. If humanity faced genocide or existential threat, then every limitation on military development would be removed. Every weapon that had been banned by treaty could be built. Every technology that had been considered too dangerous for use could be deployed. The galaxy had just taught humanity that peaceful intentions were a luxury they could not afford. The orbital shipyards above Earth had been building exploration vessels and cargo haulers for decades, but that changed within hours of the vote. Construction crews were given new blueprints and new priorities. The ships that started taking shape on those assembly lines were nothing like what had come before. These were dreadnoughts with armor thick enough to survive nuclear strikes and weapons capable of cracking moons. These were carriers that could deploy fighter wings in zero-gravity combat. These were vessels designed with one purpose, which was to bring overwhelming violence to any enemy of humanity. Colonel Danny Price commanded the Marine Corps Special Operations Division, and he got his orders directly from Admiral Cole. Danny had fought in every major conflict of the last 20 years, and he knew what the Admiral was asking for. He needed 5,000 soldiers who could board enemy ships in the middle of combat and fight room to room in zero gravity. He needed people who would not hesitate when facing something that was not human. He needed the kind of warriors that humanity had been producing since they first picked up rocks and decided to defend their caves. Danny started making calls to veterans across Earth and the colonies, and every single one of them volunteered within minutes of hearing what happened at New Haven. The training began immediately in facilities that had been built for peacetime exercises but were now repurposed for war. Danny's Marines practiced breaching alien hull materials and fighting in corridors that might have different gravity or atmosphere. They trained with weapons that could kill without decompressing a ship, and tactics that assumed the enemy would be stronger or faster or more numerous. They trained until their bodies moved on instinct, and their teams operated like single organisms. Every one of them understood what they were preparing for, and not a single soldier complained about the brutal schedule. Meanwhile, at the Prometheus research station in the asteroid belt, something else was happening that most of Earth did not know about. Dr. Christopher Hayes had been working on theoretical physics for 15 years, and his specialty was gravitational manipulation. His team had published papers about using focused gravity waves for propulsion and mining and construction. What they had not published was the research into weaponizing those same principles. Chris had argued against it for years, but he had kept the data just in case humanity ever needed it. Now Admiral Cole was standing in his laboratory asking him to build something that existed only in mathematics and simulations. Chris explained the theory while his hands shook with equal parts excitement and horror. A star was just a massive fusion reaction held together by its own gravity. The balance between the inward pull of gravity and the outward pressure of fusion was delicate. If you could disrupt that balance with precisely calibrated gravitational waves, you could make a star unstable. You could make it burn faster and hotter until it tore itself apart. Chris had never tested it because the energy requirements were enormous and the ethical implications were staggering. Admiral Cole asked him how long it would take to build a working prototype. And Chris said 6 weeks if they had unlimited resources and authorization to ignore safety protocols. The Admiral gave him both, and Chris got to work. His team of physicists and engineers stopped sleeping in their own quarters and just rotated through shifts in the laboratory. They built containment systems for miniature fusion reactors and quantum computers, capable of calculations that would take centuries on normal hardware. They assembled a gravitational wave generator that bent space-time in ways that made some of them physically ill to observe. The device that took shape over those 6 weeks was smaller than most people expected, but it contained more potential destructive power than every nuclear weapon humanity had ever built. President Carter addressed the planet in a broadcast that went out to every screen on Earth and every colony in human space. She spoke calmly, but there was steel in her voice that nobody had heard before. She said that humanity had reached out to the cosmos in peace, and that peace had been answered with genocide. She said the Vrekath would learn what humanity did to those who murdered children. She said this would serve as a lesson to every species that might be watching from their distant worlds. Humanity would not be victims and would not allow this to happen again. The speech lasted 5 minutes, and when it ended, every human in existence understood that something fundamental had changed. The fleet began assembling in orbit around Earth, and it was the most powerful force humanity had ever created. 67 warships ranging from fast destroyers to massive dreadnoughts that were 3 kilometers long. Each ship was crewed by volunteers who understood they might not come home. Each weapon system was tested and retested until the crews could operate them blind. Admiral Cole took command of the fleet from the bridge of the dreadnought Retribution, and he looked out at the assembled might of humanity with grim satisfaction. This was not the fleet he had wanted to build, but it was the fleet the galaxy had forced them to create. Behind the main fleet, moving in complete stealth, was the science vessel Acheron. Dr. Hayes and his team had installed their prototype weapon in the ship's cargo bay, and they were still running simulations on the flight out. Captain Nicole Shaw commanded the Acheron, and she understood that her ship carried the most terrible weapon humanity had ever conceived. She kept her crew focused on their jobs and did not let them think too hard about what they might be ordered to do. Some knowledge was too heavy to carry while still remaining functional. The fleet spent 9 weeks in faster-than-light travel heading toward Vrekath space, and every day Admiral Cole drilled them harder. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel 2 light-years from the Vrekath home system, and every sensor on every ship immediately went active. Commander Sarah Blake led the reconnaissance wing from her stealth cruiser Shadow, and she was the first to detect the Vrekath response. Their entire home defense fleet was assembling in a sphere formation around their primary world, 140 warships arranged in a pattern that had apparently never been broken in their military history. Sarah sent the tactical data back to Admiral Cole and added her own analysis. The Vrekath were fighting like they had won every previous battle by using superior numbers and defensive positions. Admiral Cole studied the enemy formation on the main display of the Retribution, and he almost smiled. The Vrekath had twice as many ships as humanity, but they were thinking in terms of traditional naval warfare. They expected the human fleet to come straight at them and try to break through their lines by force. They had positioned their heaviest ships at the most likely approach vectors, and their lighter vessels filled the gaps. It was a formation designed to absorb an attack and then crush the attackers with overwhelming firepower. It would have worked perfectly against any enemy that fought fair. Humanity had stopped fighting fair roughly 10,000 years ago. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was Admiral Cole's tactical officer, and he had spent the entire 9-week journey studying every battle the Vrekath had ever fought based on the intelligence data Earth had gathered. The Vrekath always used the same strategies because those strategies had always worked. They relied on their superior technology and numerical advantage, and they had never faced an enemy that adapted or improvised. Marcus highlighted 7 weak points in their formation and sent the attack plan to every ship captain in the human fleet. The human fleet split into 7 groups as they entered the Vrekath system, and each group went to maximum acceleration on different vectors. Captain Linda Foster commanded a destroyer group of 8 fast ships, and her orders were simple. She was supposed to draw the Vrekath fleet out of position by making them think her group was the main attack. Linda pushed her engines past their safety limits, and her ships came screaming in toward the Vrekath formation at speeds that made her crew nervous. The Vrekath saw her coming and did exactly what the humans wanted. They broke formation to intercept. Linda's destroyers opened fire at maximum range with missiles that carried nuclear warheads, and the Rekath point defense systems shot most of them down before they could hit. That was fine because the missiles were just a distraction. While the Rekath were focused on the incoming weapons, Linda's ships curved away on an escape vector that took them through the thickest part of the enemy formation. The Rekath heavy cruisers opened fire and Linda lost 4 ships in the first 30 seconds. Her destroyer took a direct hit that vaporized the entire port side and killed half her crew, but the ship stayed together long enough for her to complete the maneuver. She had led the Rekath fleet exactly where Admiral Cole needed them. That was when the trap sprung. Thousands of automated weapons platforms that had been deployed weeks ago by stealth drones suddenly activated throughout the system. They had been floating in the dark, running on minimal power, and the Rekath sensors had never detected them. Now they lit up with targeting systems and fired simultaneously. Nuclear-pumped laser arrays that had been banned by 3 separate Earth treaties cut through the Rekath formation from every angle. The platforms were not sophisticated, and they could only fire once before burning out, but they did not need to do more than that. They targeted engine sections and power cores with precision that only automated systems could achieve. The Rekath fleet lost cohesion in seconds. Ships that had been in perfect defensive positions suddenly found themselves crippled and drifting. Their formation that had seemed impenetrable dissolved into chaos as captains tried to respond to threats coming from every direction at once. That was when the rest of the human fleet arrived and the real battle began. Admiral Cole brought the Retribution and the heavy cruisers in from above the orbital plane, where the Rekath had not been watching. His dreadnought was 3 times the size of the largest Rekath ship, and it carried weapons that humanity had built specifically for this fight. The main guns on the Retribution fired solid. Projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed by magnetic rails. The kinetic energy of each round was equivalent to a small nuclear weapon, and they punched through Rekath armor like it was tissue paper. Cole's gunners had trained for 9 weeks to hit moving targets in 3-dimensional space, and they did not miss. A Rekath heavy cruiser took a direct hit to its central section and broke in half. Another tried to turn and expose less surface area, but the second round caught it in the engines and it went tumbling end over end while atmosphere vented from a dozen breaches. Colonel Danny Price watched the battle from the assault carrier Hammer and waited for his moment. His 5,000 Marines were loaded into modified boarding shuttles that had been painted black and covered with sensor-absorbing materials. Danny had fought in boarding actions before during the pirate conflicts around Jupiter, but this was different. The Rekath ships were larger, and their crews were trained military personnel who would fight to the death. He checked his weapons one more time and opened the channel to all his teams. He told them to remember New Haven and remember why they were here. Then he gave the order to launch. The boarding shuttles crossed the battlefield at speeds that made them nearly impossible to target. A few were hit by point defense fire and vanished in bright flashes, but most made it through. They latched onto damaged Rekath vessels with magnetic clamps, and Danny's Marines cut through the hulls with plasma torches that burned at temperatures hot enough to melt any known metal. The first teams went through the breaches with weapons ready and found themselves in corridors that were designed for creatures much larger than humans. The Rekath soldiers were waiting for them, and the close-quarters combat was brutal and immediate. The aliens were nearly 8 feet tall and stronger than any human, but Danny's people had trained for exactly this scenario. They moved in 4-person teams with overlapping fields of fire, and they used weapons that had been designed to penetrate Rekath body armor. The fighting moved through the ships room by room and corridor by corridor. Danny lost soldiers to enemy fire and to decompression when the hull breached, and to simple bad luck when they turned a corner into an ambush. But his Marines kept pushing forward because they understood this was not about victory. This was about making sure the Rekath understood what happened when you killed human children. On the Rekath flagship war leader, Thask tried to coordinate a defense, but his communications were being jammed, and his ships were scattered across the system. He was the one who had ordered the attack on New Haven, and he had expected the humans to beg for mercy, or at least try to negotiate. Instead, they had come with a fleet and tactics that were unlike anything he had encountered. He began to understand that his species had made a terrible miscalculation. The humans were not a weak species to be intimidated. They were something far more dangerous. Danny Price breached the flagship's command center with his personal team and found war leader Thask trying to rally his bridge crew. The Reketh commander was massive, and his armor was covered in marks of rank and honor. He raised a weapon that could have cut Danny in half, but Danny was faster. 3 rounds from his rifle punched through the alien's skull, and Thask dropped without making a sound. Danny looked at the body for a moment and said quietly, "That was for Katie Walsh and her students." Then he moved on to secure the rest of the ship. The battle lasted 18 hours, and by the end the space around the Vrekath homeworld was filled with debris and bodies and the wreckage of ships from both sides. Admiral Cole had lost 23 vessels and 8,000 personnel. It was the bloodiest engagement in human history, and the casualty reports made him feel sick. But the Vrekath home defense fleet had been destroyed. Every single one of their ships was either captured or reduced to scrap. The orbital space around their planet belonged to humanity now. Cole opened a broadcast channel that would reach every screen on the Vrekath homeworld below. His face appeared in their cities and their government buildings and everywhere their people gathered. He spoke through computer translators that turned his words into their language, and his voice was cold enough to freeze stars. He said the Vrekath had destroyed 12,000 human civilians without warning or mercy. He said they had murdered children and thought there would be no consequences. He said this was their one chance to surrender their leadership and submit to human authority or face complete annihilation. The Vrekath government's response came within an hour. They called humans barbaric. They called Admiral Cole a war criminal. They said humanity had no right to demand anything, and that the Vrekath would never surrender to a species as primitive and violent as humans. They demanded that the human fleet withdraw immediately and threatened retaliation if Cole did not comply. They seemed to genuinely believe they were in a position to make demands. Dr. Christopher Hayes stood in the laboratory aboard the Acheron and looked at the device that would make him either a savior or a monster, depending on who wrote the history. The Helios device was smaller than most weapons of mass destruction, and that somehow made it worse. It was just a series of connected modules sitting on a reinforced platform, but inside those modules were 6 fusion reactors and a quantum computer and a gravitational wave generator that could bend the laws of physics. Chris had spent 15 years developing the theory and 6 weeks building the reality, and now he had minutes to decide if he could live with what came next. Captain Nicole Shaw watched the countdown on her command screen and tried not to think about the scale of what they were doing. She had been a military officer for 20 years, and she had made hard decisions before. But this was different. The Helios protocol was not a weapon that destroyed ships or armies. It was a weapon that destroyed everything. She looked at Chris and saw the war happening behind his eyes. She wanted to tell him it was not his fault, but that would be a lie. He had built this thing even knowing what it could do. They were all responsible for what happened next. Chris entered the activation sequence, and the device hummed to life with a sound that made everyone in the lab feel sick. The fusion reactors spun up to full power and fed energy into the quantum computer, which began calculations so complex that watching the readouts made some of the technicians dizzy. The gravitational wave generator started to charge, and the air in the laboratory felt wrong, like space itself was being twisted into shapes it was not meant to hold. Warning lights flashed across every console, but all the readings were within acceptable parameters. The weapon was working exactly as designed, and that terrified Chris more than if it had malfunctioned. The beam that emerged from the Helios device was invisible to every sensor humanity possessed. It was not made of light or particles or radiation. It was focused, gravity-twisted, and compressed and aimed like a bullet. The beam crossed the star system at the speed of causality itself, and nothing could stop it or deflect it or even detect it until it was too late. It took 8 minutes to reach the Vrekath sun, because that was how long light took to travel that distance. In those 8 minutes, Admiral Cole ordered every human ship to go to maximum faster than light speed and evacuate to the outer system. Every captain understood what that order meant. The Vrekath on their homeworld watched the human fleet retreat and thought they had won. Their government broadcast messages of victory and claimed they had driven the humans away through superior resolve. Their military commanders congratulated themselves on standing firm against the invaders. Their scientists detected some unusual readings from their sun, but nothing that seemed immediately threatening. They thought the danger was over, and they thought their defiance had saved them. They were wrong about everything. The gravitational beam hit the Vrekath sun and penetrated deep into its core, where hydrogen atoms had been fusing into helium for billions of years. The beam disrupted the careful balance between gravity pulling inward and fusion pressure pushing outward. Nuclear reactions that had been stable since before the Vrekath evolved suddenly became chaotic. The core temperature spiked by millions of degrees in seconds. The fusion rate increased exponentially, and the star began burning fuel thousands of times faster than normal. The outer layers of the sun started to expand as the internal pressure grew beyond what gravity could contain. On the surface of the Vrekath homeworld, people looked up at their sun and saw it changing. The yellow star they had known their entire lives was growing visibly larger and turning orange. Then it turned red and the temperature on the planet started rising. At first it was just uncomfortable. Then it became dangerous. Then it became lethal. The Vrekath government finally understood what was happening, and they broadcast desperate messages to the human fleet. They offered complete surrender and reparations and anything humanity wanted. They begged for mercy and for someone to make it stop. Admiral Cole listened to their pleas from the bridge of the Retribution as his fleet raced away from the expanding disaster. His executive officer asked if they should respond, and Cole said no. He thought about Jake Morrison dying on his platform while trying to save people who could not be saved. He thought about Katie Walsh holding her students while fire rained from the sky. He thought about 12,000 people who had been given no chance to surrender and no opportunity to beg. The Vrekath had made their choice when they attacked New Haven without warning. Now they would live with the consequences, except they would not live at all. The Vrekath sun went nova, 6 hours after the Helios Protocol activated. The star that had warmed their world for millions of years exploded with the force of 1 billion nuclear weapons. The outer layers of the sun blasted outward at a significant fraction of light speed and became an expanding wall of superheated plasma. The light from the explosion was bright enough to be visible from 1,000 light-years away. Anyone looking at that region of space would see a new star appear and then slowly fade over the following months. The Vrekath homeworld died first because it was closest to the sun. The atmosphere was stripped away in seconds by radiation and stellar wind. The oceans boiled into steam, and then the steam was blown into space. The surface melted into lakes of molten rock, and then even the rock began to vaporize. Everything that the Vrekath had built over 10,000 years of civilization turned to plasma and ash. Every city and every monument and every work of art, every library and every school and every home. Billions of Vrekath died without time to understand what was happening. They simply ceased to exist as the expanding wave of stellar matter consumed their world. The 4 colony worlds in the outer system lasted a few minutes longer, but the result was the same. The expanding shell of plasma reached them and erased them just as thoroughly. Space stations and orbital facilities were vaporized. Ships that tried to escape were caught and destroyed. The Vrekath civilization that had existed for thousands of years was gone in less than an hour. Not defeated or conquered, but completely erased from existence. Where there had been cities and farms and families, there was now only expanding gas and radiation. Dr. Hayes vomited into a waste container while Captain Shaw held his shoulders. His body was shaking and he could not make it stop. The numbers on his screens told him that he had just killed more sentient beings than had died in all of human history combined. Every war and every plague and every disaster that Earth had ever experienced added together did not equal what he had done in the last 6 hours. The device had worked perfectly, and that made it so much worse. There had been no malfunction to blame and no accident to hide behind. He had built a weapon to kill a star, and he had activated it, and now billions were dead. The technicians in the laboratory were crying or staring at nothing or trying to find something to do with their hands. Nobody spoke because what words existed for this? They had all known theoretically what the Helios Protocol would do, but knowing and seeing were different things. The sensors showed them the expanding debris cloud where a solar system had been. The computers calculated the death toll and displayed it on screens that nobody wanted to look at. They had committed genocide in response to genocide, and the mathematics said it was justified, but mathematics did not have to live with the nightmares. Admiral Cole recorded a message, while his fleet maintained its course away from the destruction. He stood in front of a camera in his dress uniform, and his face showed no emotion at all. He stated the facts without embellishment or apology. The Vrekath had committed genocide against human civilians. They had refused all opportunities for surrender. Humanity had responded with overwhelming force. The Vrekath civilization no longer existed. He said this was the consequence for attacking humanity, and it would serve as a lesson to every species in the galaxy. Any civilization that committed genocide against humans would face total extinction. There would be no negotiation and no mercy. The message was broadcast on every frequency and every language humanity had encountered. It reached monitoring stations and relay satellites and deep space probes. Within days, every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy would receive it. They would see the recordings of what happened to the Vrekath sun. They would see the before and after images of a thriving solar system turned to expanding gas. They would understand that humanity possessed both the capability and the willingness to erase entire species from existence. The message ended with coordinates for the expanding debris field, so anyone who doubted could go and verify for themselves. The human fleet began its long journey home and nobody celebrated. They had won the most complete victory possible and it felt like losing. The ships were quiet and the crews went through their duties like machines. Admiral Cole walked through the retribution and saw the look in his people's eyes. They understood what they had participated in. They understood that humanity had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had proven themselves to be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and that knowledge would follow them forever. The news spread across the galaxy faster than the human fleet could travel home. Every civilization with radio telescopes had detected the Vrekath sun going nova, and the ones with faster-than-light communications received Admiral Cole's broadcast within days. The recording showed everything in detail that could not be denied or dismissed. A human colony destroyed without provocation, a military response that seemed conventional at first, then the star itself dying in ways that stars were not supposed to die. The message was clear, and it was heard by species that humanity had never encountered and did not know existed. The galactic community reacted in ways that humanity had not fully anticipated. The Zentari Collective was a federation of peaceful trading species that had maintained neutrality in every conflict for 3,000 years. They watched the recordings from the Vrekath system, and their High Council voted unanimously to sever all contact with humanity. Ambassador Diana Foster spent 6 months trying to rebuild that relationship and made almost no progress. The Zentari would not trade with a species that committed what they called stellar genocide. They would not negotiate or even acknowledge human communications. They simply closed their borders and pretended humanity did not exist. Other species had different reactions that were more complicated. The Kelrath had been conquered by the Vrekath 200 years ago, and they had spent those 2 centuries as a subject species. When they heard that the Vrekath were gone, they celebrated in ways that shocked human observers. Their government sent a delegation to Earth, led by an elderly female named Thera who had been born under Vrekath occupation. She met with President Helen Carter in private, and wept while thanking humanity for doing what the rest of the galaxy had been too afraid to do. She said the Vrekath had murdered billions of Kelrath over the years and nobody had stopped them because they were too powerful and too willing to use violence. President Carter accepted the thanks, but she did not feel good about it. She had authorized the Helios Protocol, and she would carry that decision for the rest of her life. She told Thera that humanity had not acted out of justice for other species. They had acted out of rage and the need to ensure that New Haven could never happen again. Thera said the motivation did not matter. The Vrekath were gone and that was enough. She left Earth with promises of friendship between their species, but Carter knew that friendship was built on fear as much as gratitude. The majority of galactic civilizations simply became very careful around humans. First contact protocols that had been casual before became formal and cautious. Human ships that entered foreign territory were met by military escorts even when the meetings were supposed to be peaceful. Diplomatic channels that had been opened suddenly required multiple levels of approval. The galaxy had decided that humanity was dangerous and unpredictable and needed to be handled with extreme care. Nobody wanted to be the next species that pushed humans too far. Admiral Richard Cole returned to Earth as both a hero and a war criminal depending on who was speaking. The military gave him their highest honors and threw parades in his name. The International Justice Committee launched an investigation into whether he had violated the laws of war by destroying an entire civilization. The investigation lasted 8 months and included testimony from hundreds of witnesses and analysis of thousands of documents. In the end, the committee voted to drop all charges because every government on Earth made it clear they supported Cole's decision. The admiral had done what needed to be done, and Earth would not punish him for it. Cole retired from active service and gave only one public interview. A reporter named Julie Martin asked him if he regretted erasing the Rekath species from existence. Cole looked directly at the camera and said he regretted it every single day. He said he saw the faces of the Rekath who died in his dreams and probably would for the rest of his life. But he also said he would make the same decision again without hesitation. The Rekath had murdered 12,000 humans, including children, and thought there would be no consequences. He had made sure that could never happen again. If that made him a monster, then he could live with being a monster. Dr. Christopher Hayes never worked on the Helios device again and refused to discuss the technical details with anyone. He moved to a small research station on Mars where he studied peaceful applications of gravitational technology. He published papers about using gravity waves for construction and mining and deep space communication. He refused all interviews and all awards and all recognition for his role in the Frekath campaign. The people who knew him said he was not the same person who had left Earth. Something had broken inside him when he activated the weapon, and it never healed properly. The Helios device itself was transported to Earth under military guard and placed in the deepest vault that humanity had ever constructed. The facility was built 3 kilometers underground and required authorization from 12 different governments just to enter. The United Earth Council passed a resolution that the weapon could only be activated by unanimous vote of all member nations and only in response to existential threat. The resolution also mandated that any use of the Helios protocol would require a 30-day waiting period to ensure the decision was not made in anger. The device sat in its vault surrounded by guards and monitoring systems, and humanity prayed it would never be needed again. But everyone knew it was there. Every species in the galaxy knew that humans possessed the capability to kill stars and the willingness to use that capability if pushed. That knowledge changed how humanity was treated in ways both obvious and subtle. Trade negotiations that might have dragged on for years were concluded in weeks. Border disputes were settled in humanity's favor without argument. Pirates and raiders who had harassed human shipping suddenly found other targets. The galaxy had learned to be polite to the species that could erase solar systems. Colonel Danny Price came home to Earth and spent a year in therapy before he could function normally. The close-quarters combat on the Rekath ships had been brutal in ways that most people could not imagine. He had lost 300 Marines in those boarding actions, and he knew every one of their names. He never spoke publicly about what happened on those ships or what he had seen or what he had done. But he accepted a position training. The next generation of Marines and his students learned to be efficient and ruthless when necessary, and absolutely committed to protecting human civilians above all else. The colonies reacted to New Haven's destruction with a mixture of grief and determination. Memorial services were held on every human world, and the names of all 12,000 victims were read aloud. Katie Walsh became the symbol of innocent lives lost. Her story was taught in schools and her picture appeared in museums. Children learned about the teacher who sang to her students while the world burned. They learned that she represented everything worth protecting and everything worth avenging. New Haven was never rebuilt, but the debris field where it had existed became a sacred site that no ship was allowed to enter without permission. Every colony received military protection after New Haven. Orbital defense platforms were upgraded with weapons that could fight off a major assault. Garrison forces were stationed on every world with more than 1,000 inhabitants. The exploration vessels that humanity sent into unknown space were accompanied by warships. The peaceful expansion that Earth had dreamed of continued, but now everyone understood it was an expansion backed by terrible power. Humanity would still seek out new worlds and new friends, but they would do so with their guns loaded and their defenses active. 5 years after the Rekath annihilation, Earth received an unexpected communication. The Galactic Assembly was a loose coalition of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, and they had existed for thousands of years. They invited Ambassador Ronald Clark to their central station, which was a massive structure in neutral space that had been built before humanity discovered fire. Ronald traveled there with a military escort and found himself in a chamber with representatives from 40 different species. Some were humanoid and some were so alien that looking at them made his eyes hurt. The Assembly presented humanity with a treaty that had taken them 3 years to write. The document recognized human territorial claims and sovereignty. It promised that no member species would interfere in human affairs or threaten human colonies. In exchange, humanity agreed to use proportional force in conflicts and to submit major military actions to review by the Assembly. It was a compromise, but one that was weighted heavily in humanity's favor. The galaxy was offering Earth a seat at the table of major powers, but only because they were terrified of what would happen if humanity was excluded. Ronald read the treaty carefully and consulted with President Carter and the Earth Council. After 2 weeks of negotiation over minor details, he signed the document on behalf of humanity. Earth officially joined the galactic community, but not as the hopeful explorers they had wanted to be. They joined as a military power to be respected and feared. The treaty was celebrated on Earth, but the celebration felt hollow to those who remembered what it had cost to earn that respect. The most unexpected consequence came from the youth of other species.